All right, I think I'm ready to kick this off. Hello, my name is Laura Brandis, and I'm the Communications Director at the POLIS Water Sustainability Project at the University of Victoria. And I'm really pleased to welcome you to today's webinar as we kick off the 4th season of our Creating a Blue Dialogue webinar series. So this is exciting for us. And the goal with this series is to bring together in one space water champions and professionals from all backgrounds to learn about and discuss emerging and innovative ideas in water policy and governance. So I'm really happy that you all are here with us today. And today's webinar is being hosted in partnership with the Canadian Freshwater Alliance, and I'll be handing the mic over to Susie Porter from the Alliance in just a couple of minutes. Of course, we couldn't carry out this series without our various supporters and funders, all of whom are listed on this slide. And in particular, I want to thank the Canadian Water Network, who have been supporting our series since it started back in 2010, and also the Freshwater Alliance for their help in making today's session happen. So I know a few of you on the line have attended our webinars before, and you'll know that there's always a few housekeeping things that I like to run through before we begin. The first thing is how the audio works. So as you've all probably realized, I have a blanket mute on all of the participants. This is because we're expecting a fairly large number of people in the room, and we just want to avoid any background noise, audio feedback, things like that. So how do we handle questions? Well, you guys are already making good use of the chat box, and when we get to the end of both presentations today, we'll open up the chat box. You guys can type your questions there, comments there. Feel free to sort of banter back and forth with each other. And both Tim Morris and Angus McAllister, our speakers today, will be on the line as our panelists to answer those questions as they come in. And now a number of you are already introducing yourselves in the chat box. I always like to get a sense of the community that we've created with these webinars. So if you haven't already, please feel free to let us know who you are, maybe what organization you're with, and also how many people are listening on your end. I know sometimes people sign out rooms, so if there's a group, we'd love to know who you all are. And as you do that, I'll let you know who today's speakers are. So in a few moments, you'll be hearing from Tim Morris, who's a consultant specializing in strategic and policy advice related to freshwater protection. Tim has worked in both the NGO and philanthropic sectors protecting Canada's freshwater, and some of you may know him from his role at the Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation, where he spent the last 5 years leading its freshwater protection program. And Tim is also the co-author of the recent report, The State of the Water Movement in British Columbia, which you'll be hearing about today. And this was a co-publication from us. Here at POLIS, along with the Real Estate Foundation of BC. And our second speaker today is Angus McAllister. He's the lead researcher at Fathom 6 Strategies, which does public opinion research with a particular focus on sustainability and environmental issues. He has extensive experience from telephone polls and focus groups to online polls and web analytics. And today he'll be discussing the results of a series of focus groups on attitudes on freshwater protection in Canada, with a particular focus on attitudes in British Columbia. And he'll also talk a bit about how these findings point to important lessons for how we can better engage the public in conversations and action around freshwater issues. So just before I hand the mic over to Tim, I am going to invite Susie from the Freshwater Alliance to bring her voice on the line, and she'll be the lead-in to Tim and Angus's presentations today. So Susie, if you want to press *6 so we can hear you, that'd be fantastic.
Alrighty, well, good morning, everyone. It's Susie Porter speaking to you. I'm in Vancouver, which, as you can probably tell from the chat, is a gorgeous sunny day here. I'm the BC organizer with the Canadian Freshwater Alliance, and we're kind of a new kid on the block. We're entering our second year now, so hopefully getting the word out a bit more. Essentially, our goal is really to help support and cultivate the kind of creation and the furthering of a freshwater movement in Canada, really bringing together all the diverse facets of the freshwater community. There's about a couple thousand of us in Canada, a couple hundred of us in BC. If you can believe, over half of the environmental groups in BC are working on freshwater issues. So it's a really huge community with a lot of potential, and we're really trying to support the work that all of us do using specific kind of communications and engagement tools and trainings and supporting things like polling. So I was just going to give a tiny little bit of background about how this poll business in particular kind of started on our side, at least in 2012. We were working with Angus McAllister, who you'll hear from in just a sec, doing some focus groups here in BC. There were 8 of them that we did, and we were really trying to look at the different aspects of how the public and how different facets of the public think and act on freshwater issues. So out of those conversations came a number of findings, including the importance of knowing who your audience is, our audience is, knowing that they're trying to reach a diverse public. Things like stories and framing matter, and facts alone don't connect us with people, but the stories do. And this powerful notion that there's a few groups already that are really working with this idea of home water, so that reminding people that if we live here, our water is ours to defend and to protect. So there's a number of these findings that we found in those focus groups, but they weren't statistically significant. And we wanted to work with Angus to test if these are, as I said, statistically significant across the country. And that's really kind of a bit of history, at least from our perspective, about where this polling work came. And just something to think about as you listen to Tim's research on the freshwater movement in BC and Angus's work on polling, is really how we can use this kind of information and this kind of data, which is extremely important for our community as we frame the stories that we're essentially trying to tell, which is really what we are trying to do to get more supporters, to work on issues that matter to us and to our communities. So to really think about how we can situate the data and the facts that we're going to be hearing into a story that we can tell about us and our work. So I think I'll leave it with that and pass it back to you, Laura. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Susie. So Tim, it's you're up on the docket if you want to press *6 on your line to bring your voice on the line, and you're welcome to take it away.
Hello, can you hear me, Laura? Sorry, I was trying to unmute and it was uncooperative.
We can hear you now. All right, do your thing.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Laura, and a great lead-in, Susie, to both mine and Angus's presentation. I'm basically just the warm-up act for Mr. Angus McAllister's presentation, so I'll try and keep my presentation as concise and engaging as possible. I always like to start off with just the key takeaways, so that if folks are a little sleepy out there on the West Coast, they can go back to bed for a few minutes. So the 3 things I think I want you guys to take away, really first, that there is I think a very large and diverse water community in British Columbia. The second thing is we found there's a real clear desire in this community for more local control at the watershed scale, although supported by strong provincial laws and oversight. And the third thing is I think there's a big opportunity for what we're calling an emerging or nascent water movement to really become something that's much more full-blown in terms of a movement, and that this could really raise the bar on water protection in British Columbia. So it's big and diverse, local control, and an opportunity to build and broaden the movement. Those are the 3 takeaways. So just to give you a bit of background, and I've got to get used to advancing my slides here. This is the report that we published in July, and as Laura mentioned, it was co-sponsored by the POLIS project and the Real Estate Foundation of British Columbia. And really the goal of this project was to assess, in kind of as comprehensive a way as possible, who's working on freshwater issues in British Columbia, what their concerns are, and what type of support could help strengthen their collective efforts. So in this process, we started off by identifying all the groups that are out there and we came up with well over 230 organizations across the province that we sent a survey to, and many of them filled it out. And we also interviewed 11 water experts from a diverse range of backgrounds, including sort of provincial policy to real grassroots work, as well as First Nations. And we think the findings that we discovered were really rich and illuminating. And I'm just going to kind of share a bit of a snapshot of what we found with you this morning. Just a little side note, we didn't include governments in our survey work. First Nations organizations were sent the survey, but this is by no means a comprehensive assessment of what's happening at the First Nation scale. And we didn't include the private sector or sort of associations of private interest. So just to start with kind of a bit of a visual of the landscape, I guess, of water groups out there. We were able to compile this map based on the organizations we sent the survey to, as well as those that completed it. And this map just gives you kind of a sense of the geographic diversity of this water community. And as you can see, there is definitely a concentration in some of the urban areas, but I think a really encouraging diversity outside of the urban areas as well. So the water community is all across the province, and definitely diverse in geographic scope. And then when it comes to the scale that these groups are working at, there's also a lot of diversity with a pretty neat kind of pyramid that starts from the ground up. So we had 90% of the respondents to the survey say that they work at the community or grassroots level. And when we looked at who the respondents were, you could see that there were definitely a lot of local organizations that responded. So it's from groups like the Stream Keepers to like Windermere Ambassadors, some of the more rural groups like the Baker Creek Enhancement Society, as well as a bunch of groups like Fish and Game Clubs, land trusts, ratepayer associations, just a huge diversity of groups working at that grassroots scale. And kind of on the next step up in the pyramid, you've got a number of regional basin level efforts. 2/3 of the respondents said they work at this scale. And your kind of archetype of basin level work would be sort of Fraser Basin Council, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. The Okanagan Basin Water Board, obviously working at the Okanagan watershed scale. And then groups like Wildsight, which focus in the Columbia and interior. A smaller number, only 1/3, said they work provincially. So this would be some of your more typical environmental groups, like Sierra Club BC, as well as groups like Watershed Watch Salmon Society, and the BC Wildlife Federation, which has a focus on water. And then an even smaller number work nationally, so groups like the Freshwater Alliance, Living Lakes Canada as well. Eco Justice would be another group that works nationally and has a focus on water, and of course the POLIS project. And then finally at the very top of the pyramid, there are groups that call themselves international. Some of these would have been binational organizations working across transboundary watersheds, but also some were large global organizations like WWF. So that just gives you a bit of a sense of the different scales of work that's happening across BC, and really it's very comprehensive from all the way from the international scale down to the grassroots. And what are these groups actually doing? Again, it's really quite diverse, a whole range of things, starting with sort of on-the-ground stuff like cleanups. Community monitoring is now becoming increasingly popular and important as government cuts back on monitoring work. Restoration work, so a lot of efforts to restore wetlands, streams, and rivers. As well as local advocacy, so here's the folks in Shawnigan protesting some of the development proposals happening in their region. Policy reports, this one was from the Watershed Watch Salmon Society. Political engagement, this came from a candidates debate in Chilliwack in the last election. And more generally, just a lot of public education and awareness raising, and this picture is from a video that was done by WWF featuring Scott Niedermeyer, who's a well-known hockey player. So the question is, with all this work happening out there, does this all add up to a movement? And probably a good place to start is just asking, well, what is a movement? And in our report, we use a definition. It comes from the Encyclopedia Britannica that has 3 elements to it. And the first piece, and I'll just give you a second to read this, is up on the slide now. Hopefully you can see that. So I think you could say that there is definitely a kind of a loose, organized, but sustained campaign for water protection in BC. And then the second part of this definition, again, I'll just give you a second to read that. I think arguably you could say there has been a coming together around BC of water organizations, particularly around the BC Water Act of late. And I'll discuss as well another kind of item which you could say is a sort of shared outlook on where water governance and protection should be going in British Columbia. So I think these 2 pieces, arguably you could say there's a kind of a match in British Columbia. However, there's a third piece to this definition. I'm going to come back to that in a minute, and I would say that's still missing. So I think it's fair to say, and this is what we say in our report, that there's really an emerging movement in British Columbia around water, but it isn't yet fully blown. So just before I get into what might help to take this emerging movement to the next level, I did want to touch on some of the other findings in the report that relate to issues of concern, perceptions of power and decision-making, as well as the capacity needs of the groups within this water community. So what are some of the hot-button issues? Well, obviously with water, it kind of varies from region to region, especially at the local scale. But there were a number of overarching issue areas that came to the fore that have kind of broader provincial scale implications. So the first one is the BC Water Act, and this was really top of mind, perhaps because of all the media attention and people's engagement in this process. So a lot of groups and experts raised this as a priority issue. And really there was universal support for reforming what is well over 100 years old act. Another top-level issue, top-of-mind issue is climate change. A lot of people mention this, with one expert describing it as coming at us like a runaway freight train. So it's not only the impacts that are happening right now from climate change, but the impacts that we're going to be seeing in the future. And First Nations rights was also really a kind of a priority issue for a lot of people. And I think it's kind of twofold. First being the need and the recognition that First Nations rights and legally protected constitutional rights have to be recognized by the government when government is putting in place laws and taking action on water. The second, I think, is at a more local scale, and it's really about finding ways to work in partnership with First Nations and ensuring that First Nations are kind of at the forefront of shared decision-making at the watershed scale. So those were the 3 kind of standout priority issues. And then there were a number of others that were mentioned multiple times. And these included fracking issues, natural gas and LNG, particularly of concern in northern BC. Issues around salmon and fish protection, especially related to ecosystem or in-stream flow needs. Drinking source water protection. And then really, and this is an image of a pipeline bursting, but what I wanted to show was the cumulative impacts of many different sources of development and industrial activity and how they all come together. And that's really a concern for lots of communities, is not just how one of these things is happening, but how they're all adding up. So we also asked participants in the survey and the interviews who they felt had the greatest influence over the decision-making around water. And the results, I think, to me were quite illuminating, perhaps not entirely surprising, with oil and gas being seen as having the greatest influence on decision-making, followed by the resource sector, companies like in forestry, gravel mining, BC Hydro, obviously very influential in British Columbia, and then sort of related, IPPs, independent power projects, all these industries were perceived as having significant influence on decision making. Agricultural interests were kind of in the middle of the pack, but definitely more prevalent in certain areas. Municipalities, I was a bit surprised that they were further down on the power spectrum. I thought they'd be higher up, but clearly a perception that they're not having as much influence as maybe they could be. First Nations, still lower. Environmental groups, even lower in terms of influence. And then, rather sadly, I guess, at the bottom we had, and I've kind of grouped these together, but we have watershed groups, community groups, and citizens. And unfortunately, citizens were seen as the very bottom of the pile in terms of influence. Now, when asked about what influence these groups should have, kind of desired influence on decision-making, I was sort of expecting a complete flip of this, but it wasn't actually the case. So what groups said is that they would ideally like to see watershed-based organizations at the top of the power pyramid, with citizens and community groups kind of just behind, but then the rest of the organizations kind of in the middle. So really looking for a balancing out of power, not necessarily a flip, but greater balance between the various interests within the watershed. And then when you kind of boil down the stats, the quantitative research along with some of the qualitative research from the interviews and the commentary in the survey, what it really came down to was looking for a shift in the power dynamic to what you can summarize as more local control. So in other words, really more citizen and community involvement in decision-making at a local or watershed scale, and less for kind of the private and industrial interest. But also recognizing that water is kind of a multi-scale issue, a lot of people recognize that we also need strong provincial oversight and strong enforcement. And this is something that is currently perceived to not really be there. Yes, the province is kind of the key player in water management right now, but it isn't taking as strong or as firm actions as it needs to be to protect water in BC. So that's kind of the key theme, I think, in terms of the direction of governance based on the findings of our survey and interviews. Then when we ask people about their capacity needs, what they need to be more effective, more influential, we had a range of different responses, but I just want to highlight the top four here, and you can kind of group them into two. So the ones that are in orange or yellow there relate really to having more influence on government. So connect back to that idea of local control with provincial oversight. And then the middle two are really about engaging communities more effectively and being better at engaging citizens in the grassroots. So again, it's kind of the local control piece. So the local control with provincial oversight kept coming through in this work. And then just a bit further down, I wanted to highlight number 9 there. So while this wasn't ranked high by all groups, there were a subset of groups that really thought this was kind of their priority need. So the idea of taking on more formal decision-making responsibility. And so there are a number of organizations that really said they were very interested in trying to figure out ways to take on more decision-making at their local level. And then just in terms of what water leaders wanted to learn from other water leaders, from their peers, I'm just going to highlight the top one here because I was a bit surprised because I thought it was going to be a bit of a niche thing, but watershed governance models came out on top here. And again, I think that reflects just a general interest in understanding how in a constructive governance way we can move towards more local control and more community involvement in decision-making at the watershed scale. So I thought that was a pretty interesting finding. So I mentioned before that we see this as kind of an emerging or nascent water movement. It's not full-blown yet by any means. And what do we think is missing right now? Well, I would say it's really the sense of a strong network or kind of connective tissue, I guess, is another way of framing it, at a horizontal scale, so between different organizations working in different regions, but also vertically, so between local groups, regional groups, and provincial groups. And our findings showed that that's where the networks were least strong, is kind of vertically between those different scales. So right now, it's kind of like lots of isolated little pods of activity, which brings us to the third part of that definition of what makes a movement. Again, I'll just give you a second to read this. So I think it's really the ideas of the idea of long-term aims and this sort of sustained association that are currently missing within the water community. And a lot of this, I think, comes down to capacity for groups and also the lack of infrastructure to support a more connected community. So if we had those things in place, more capacity, better infrastructure, what could a movement actually look like? Okay, well, not like this, obviously. So we're not suggesting that everybody does the same thing and act the same way. We don't want to see one giant coalition of zombies, basically, acting all the same way. There's real strength in the diversity of the community that's out there. So it needs to be something that looks a little bit more like this, and that's something that builds on the strength and the diversity of the community, organizations in the community. So, you know, a bit like the kind of the fellowship in Lord of the Rings, or more recently, I guess, in pop culture, the Avengers. Only, I think, with more women, because there seems to always be a lack of women in these pictures. So really what we're looking for is to bring together these various superpowers that organizations have, right? Whether it's your kind of queens of community monitoring, the heroes of stream keeping, the ass kickers of local advocacy, or the wizards of water policy. We need all these skill sets, but we need them working together in a slightly more cohesive way. Yeah, I can see some of these comments, Angus and Susie. So how do we build this capacity infrastructure to support such a movement? Well, I think it would be helpful to have some kind of a coordinating body or coordinating mechanisms. And the job here would be to facilitate information sharing, create opportunities for that peer-to-peer learning. Clearly, there's interest in learning from other water leaders. And just to generally support the networking and collaboration amongst the groups that have shared priorities. And whether or not such a body exists, I think there is a key need to bring groups together for shared learning and to stimulate collaboration. So the report suggests a number of ways to do this, which include an annual in-person gathering of water leaders from across the province, regional workshops to make it a little easier for groups to come together. Sometimes can be hard to travel large distances. And then many other ways of kind of online forum exchange. I think it's hard to replace the in-person networking, but you can certainly supplement it with the online stuff. So number 3 recommendations from the report was we need some success stories. We need examples of local watershed governance that work and that we can point to be replicated and scaled up. We do have the Okanagan Basin Water Board, but it's a bit of a lonely example right now, and it would certainly be nice to see some others popping up. I think many of you are familiar with some of the things that are happening in the Cowichan and the Cowichan Watershed Board. It seems to me that's a great opportunity to seed a new watershed governance model. As well, I think right now this week they're holding a conference in the Columbia Basin to explore ways of doing the same in their region. So I think having some of these pilots and success stories would really help add some impetus. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the top identified needs was for groups to be able to better engage and communicate with their supporters, with their communities, with their citizens. And as Susie mentioned, this is something that the Alliance is developing some programs around. And I think kind of having these specific trainings and tools for engaging your supporters, engaging the community, is going to be really key for building that kind of the groundswell that needs to power this movement. And then finally, there was substantial interest from many organizations in being part of a province-wide campaign. I mean, the caveat here is clearly local groups have capacity challenges, but they were still very interested in being part of a broader effort. And I think the key to have that be effective is really to engage the grassroots and First Nations from the outset, so that it's not a top-down effort, but really driven from the ground up. Okay, so those are the recommendations that we had in the report. Just as a reminder, the report is available at the POLIS website there. I've got a link on the screen. Hopefully you can see that. And just to wrap up, I wanted to read a final passage from the report, which is basically, let me start. So this is a critical time for freshwater management in British Columbia. In many ways, we're at a watershed. We have the promise of a new Water Act and mounting pressures on the health of our rivers, lakes, and aquifers from a wide range of threats. The importance of a vibrant, connective, and assertive freshwater movement has never been greater. So I'm going to wrap up with that, but I'm happy